Suddenly, the hospital laboratory exploded, and the flames instantly engulfed the entire space. Both I and Lu Xinyu, the goddess in the hospital, were trapped in the sea of fire simultaneously. My boyfriend, Xie Xun, unhesitatingly chose to save her, leaving me in the raging inferno. I neither stopped him nor begged, but silently accepted his choice. Because in my previous life, I once confessed that I was the daughter of the dean and threatened him with his future to save me. As a result, Lu Xinyu was buried in the flames. Later, he inherited my family's property. However, on the day of my due date, he locked me in the laboratory and set fire to kill me and my child. Facing my pleading, he sneered and said, "Zhong Wani, if you hadn't threatened me with the Zhong family back then, how could Xinyu have died so tragically? I will make you pay back 100-fold for the suffering Xinyu endured in the fire." When I opened my eyes again, I was reborn back to the day when Lu Xinyu and I were both trapped in the fire. With a loud bang, the cabinet smashed heavily onto me, and the excruciating pain woke me up instantly. The thick smoke choked me so much that I couldn't open my eyes, and could only cover my mouth and cough violently. A crushing pain came from my lower abdomen. I subconsciously protected my stomach, but found that my originally almost full-term abdomen had become flat. How could this be? Before I could react, Xie Xun's urgent shouts came to my ears. Xinyu, how are you?" Immediately after, Lu Xinyu's weak voice came. "Xie Xun, save me." I looked up in disbelief, and saw Xie Xun frantically moving the table that was pressing on her. The scene in front of me was so real that I finally realized that I had been reborn. Reborn to the day when Lu Xinyu and I were both trapped in the fire. At the entrance of the laboratory, my colleague Wang Xinru shouted heart-rendingly, "Xie Xun, are you crazy? Save Wani first. She's your girlfriend." Xie Xun finally moved the table away. Without even looking at me, he picked up Lu Xinyu and rushed out. I smiled self-deprecatingly. In my previous life, wasn't he also like this? I was his girlfriend, yet he had eyes only for Lu Xinyu. Yes, Lu Xinyu was so beautiful. She was not only the goddess in the hospital, but also rumored to be the daughter of Lu's medical group. Even if Xie Xun wasn't single, he must have fallen in love with her long ago. I struggled to stand up, but was firmly pinned down by the cabinet. My calf was cut by the glass and bleeding profusely, and I couldn't move at all. It seemed that Xie Xun only noticed me now. There was no worry in his eyes, only disgust. He frowned and said, "Xinyu is the daughter of Lu's medical group. If anything happens to her, the hospital will be doomed. I'm doing this for the overall situation. You're not seriously injured. Wait until I send Xinyu out, and then come back to save you." I smiled again. If I hadn't been reborn, I might have believed his so-called for the overall situation. I was covered in blood, yet in his words, I was not seriously injured. Wang Xinru was about to rush into the fire without thinking. Fortunately, she was firmly held back by the colleagues behind her. "Xinru, calm down. There are flammable and explosive items in the laboratory. It's very dangerous." Yes, in my memory, this laboratory would explode in about 15 minutes. In my previous life, after I was rescued, I quickly told everyone to leave quickly, thus saving everyone's lives. Originally, Xie Xun wanted to go back to save Lu Xinyu again, but seeing the increasingly large fire, he ultimately didn't go back in. So in this life, how could I believe that he would come back to save me later? I knew he wouldn't, but I also didn't want to implicate those who truly cared about me. I propped myself up on the ground and shouted with all my might, "Xinru, don't come in. This place is about to explode. Run quickly." Hearing me shout about the explosion, Xie Xun's steps of holding Lu Xinyu paused for a moment. He turned back and looked at me in disbelief, his eyes cold, as if looking at a stranger. "Zhong Wani, how come I never noticed that you are so scheming? Clearly, if we wait another half an hour, the fire brigade will arrive and be able to control the fire. With you saying this, how will the colleagues outside view me? Can't you be more kind-hearted like Xinyu?" I was so angered by his hypocritical appearance that I laughed. "When you were having sex with me, why didn't you say I was scheming?" Lu Xinyu saw this and gently pulled the collar of Xie Xun, saying weakly, "Xie Xun, I'm in pain." Hearing Lu Xinyu's voice, Xie Xun instantly shifted his gaze from me to her. "Hold on, Xinyu. I won't let anything happen to you." Then he carried her, and walked away without looking back. I used all my strength to push away the heavy cabinet, and the excruciating pain came in waves. But compared to the pain I experienced in my previous life, this was nothing. Seeing this scene, Wang Xinru sat down on the ground in disbelief. "Xie Xun, you bastard. The dean won't let you get away with this." Wang Xinru was the only one in the hospital who knew my identity, but these words only brought more ruthless mockery from Xie Xun. He sneered contemptuously, his tone full of disdain. "The dean won't let me get away with it? Ridiculous. Xinyu is the only daughter of Lu's medical group. If something happens to her, the dean won't let me get away with it. I struggled to crawl out from the gap between the cabinet and the ground. The wound on my leg was torn, and the blood stained my whole body. But I couldn't care less. I had to survive. Seeing that time was running out, I suddenly shouted at Wang Xinru. Don't beg him. Run. I will never forget. In my previous life, at the very moment when Xie Xun poured gasoline over me, his eyes were brimming with madness. There was not a single trace of love. Instead, it was filled with surging hatred like a raging tide. I cried out in agony, my voice tearing through the air, yet he turned a deaf ear. Completely disregarding the child in my womb, he lit the fire without the slightest hesitation. It was at that moment that I realized that over the years, he had been blaming me for Lu Xinyu's death, and loathed me to the core. While the excruciating pain of the memory was still spreading in my heart, Wang Xinru rushed into the sea of fire without a second thought. Wani, hold on. The thick smoke billowed, choking me so severely that I coughed violently. My vision was blurred, yet Wang Xinru's petite but resolute figure stood out prominently in the firelight. You're fucking crazy. Get out. I roared with all my might, but she seemed not to hear. Gritting her teeth, she laboriously hoisted half of my body, and step by arduous step, struggled to move towards the outside of the laboratory. The searing air scorched our skin. I even saw a strand of her hair get singed, with the tip still glinting with sparks. Yet she seemed impervious to the pain, and continued dragging me forward. Looking at her soot-blackened profile, a myriad of emotions welled up within me. With great effort, I raised my hand and stole a glance at my watch. Time was running out. If we didn't get out soon, we would both lose our lives here. I took a deep breath, mustered my strength and shouted at her. Shinro, in a moment. When I count 3, 2, 1, we'll leap out. Don't worry about me. Got it. Wang Xinru didn't look back and replied firmly. You can shout all you want. I'll never let go. A warmth spread through my heart, and I stopped talking. My eyes were fixed intently on the laboratory door, which was our only hope of survival. 3, 2, 1, jump! I screamed at the top of my lungs, and then without hesitation, I pulled Wang Xinru and leaped towards the door. Boom! Just as we rushed out of the door, a deafening explosion resounded behind us. The powerful shockwave flung me to the ground. I felt as if my eardrums were about to burst. My vision went blank, and my senses of sight and hearing vanished instantaneously. Only the endless ringing in my ears echoed in my mind. Wani, how are you? Can you hear me? After what seemed like an eternity, Wang Xinru's anxious shouts reached my ears intermittently. I tried my best to open my eyes. I'm okay, just my leg. Wang Xinru followed my gaze and looked down. It's not a pretty sight. Don't look. Wait for me a moment. With that, Wang Xinru scurried away in a flurry. Moments later, Wang Xinru came hurrying back with several colleagues carrying a stretcher. When they saw the injury on my leg, their expressions immediately turned solemn. A young male colleague couldn't help but exclaim, "Good heavens! How many stitches will this need?" My entire body ached unbearably, as if it were falling apart, yet my mind was unusually clear. As we passed by an emergency department, I saw Xie Xun. He was gently embracing Lu Xinyu's shoulders, whispering words of comfort. He looked as if nothing had happened, as if he had long since forgotten about me. The head nurse, who usually had a good relationship with me, was examining my injuries while shaking her head in distress. Wani, what kind of misfortune have you endured? There are so many fractures all over your body. It might take a full year for you to recover. As she spoke, her voice began to quiver with sobs. Fortunately, your right hand wasn't injured. After proper recuperation, you can still perform surgeries. I forced a weak smile, trying to say something, but the pain rendered me speechless. The head nurse then lowered her voice, as if afraid of being overheard, and muttered, That Lu Xinyu, they say she only has a minor scratch. Look how nervous Dr. Xie is, tsk. Upon hearing this, Wang Xinru flew into a rage and pointed at Xie Xun, yelling, Xie Xun, you're fucking disgusting. Before Wang Xinru could finish, Lu Xinyu coughed delicately, her voice sweet and soft. Xie Xun, I'm a bit tired. Xie Xun immediately comforted her tenderly. Xinyu, hold on a little longer. The colleagues will be here soon. Then he looked up, cast a glance at me, and said impatiently to Wang Xinru, Wani is fine now, isn't she? What business is it of yours between me and Wani? Can you just mind your own business? I stared fixedly at Xie Xun's repulsive face, and said word by word. From now on, we have nothing to do with each other. We're breaking up. Wang Xinru nodded vigorously. Good riddance. Reasoning with a brute like him is simply a waste of breath. Xie Xun was taken aback, seemingly not expecting me to say that. He frowned, his face full of impatience. Wani, what new trick are you trying to pull? Are you playing with me? I sneered. Playing with you? You're not worthy. I fought back my tears and, looking at Lu Xinyu behind him, said icily, You would rather save another woman than me. Is this the so-called boyfriend you are? Lu Xinyu's tears welled up instantly, and she sobbed pitifully. Wani, how can you say such a thing? Xie Xun just thinks you're stronger than me, and has more confidence in you. He just chose to save someone who needed him more. The ward was in chaos. Xie Xun's accusations and Lu Xinyu's sobs intertwined, attracting numerous onlookers outside. Alas, what the goddess said makes sense. She's so delicate and surely needs more care. Exactly. Dr. Xie is also doing it for the greater good. Why is Dr. Zhong being so persistent? Indeed, Miss Lu is the daughter of Lu's medical group. Saving her is naturally more important. Just then, my father rushed back from abroad in a hurry. When Xie Xun saw him, he immediately put on a false front and greeted him. Dean, just now, the laboratory exploded. I risked my life to save Xinyu. Xinyu said she can strengthen the cooperation between Lu's medical group and our hospital. My father's face darkened and he asked, Where's Zhong Wani? Thinking the dean was going to hold him accountable, Xie Xun quickly said, Dean, at that time, there were only her and Wani in the laboratory. Xinyu definitely couldn't have made a mistake. Wani should be fully responsible for this matter. She has just been rescued, and her injuries aren't severe. However, I think we'd better not let her participate in experiments in the future. Xinyu can handle it alone. My father's expression grew even uglier. Lying on the hospital bed, I sneered inwardly. Just you wait, without me, Zhong Wani, you Xie Xun, will have plenty of hardships in the future. Before I could clearly see my father's face, I fell into a deep coma. When I woke up again, it was already the evening of the next day. My hands and feet were wrapped in thick plaster and bandages immobilized. Yet, I felt a sense of rebirth. Wani, Wang Xinru, despite her tired face, couldn't hide her excitement, and pounced onto the side of my bed. I tried to raise my hand to respond to her, but the movement caused a sharp pain in my wound. Looking at my appearance, she could no longer hold back her tears. You fool! Do you know how seriously you're injured? I smiled weakly. At least I've got my life back. In this life, I don't owe Xie Xun anything. Neither my father nor I will die. You! Wang Xinru laughed and cried at the same time, wiping her tears with a tissue. I've already told your father what happened. When he heard the news, he was so angry that he's going to hold an accident accountability meeting tomorrow. At the mention of my father, my tears welled up. In my previous life, because of me, my father, Xinru, I tried to calm my emotions. I have one more thing to ask you. What is it? The surveillance footage before the laboratory accident. Can you get it for me? Wang Xinru stroked my hair and said casually, Don't worry. I've already had someone retrieve it. There were some minor issues in the middle, but don't worry, I've taken care of everything. Looking at her, I was filled with guilt. In my previous life, I was brainwashed by Xie Xun, and thought Wang Xinru was jealous of me and always targeting me. I even had a huge fight with her and severed our friendship. I never got to apologize to her before I died. Now thinking back, I could only blame myself for being blind and mistaking her sincerity for ill will. Just as I was about to close my eyes and rest, Xie Xun arrived, with Lu Xinyu trailing behind him. She was dressed to the nines, standing there perfectly, not a hair out of place, flirtatiously twirling her hair in a charming manner, drawing the curious glances of those around. In contrast, I was swathed tightly in plaster, unable to move an inch. Wang Xinru took a deep breath and sneered. Oh, look at the goddess. She's as right as rain, isn't she? Xie Xun ignored her and walked straight towards me, attempting to take my hand. I recoiled in disgust. Instead of realizing his wrongdoings, he even smiled and said, Wani, look, you're all right now. Xinyu said she'll strengthen the cooperation between Lu's medical group and our hospital. I might get a promotion. Aren't you happy for me? I couldn't help but sneer. Happy? I almost died in the laboratory, and you expect me to be happy? At this moment, Lu Xinyu feigned a sigh, her eyes darkening as she said, I never thought you'd be so selfish. Just because of this unfounded jealousy, you'd rather ruin Xie Xun's future. Honestly, I really look down on you. I looked at her coldly. Do you know what it means to have one's future completely ruined? Let me tell you, from the moment Xie Xun gave up on saving me, his future was already gone. Xie Xun pointed at me, his brows knitted into a knot. Zhong Wani, Xinyu came to see you out of kindness, and was even going to apologize to you. Yet you have such an attitude? Don't forget, I'm your boyfriend. Instead of being grateful, you're actually cursing me? I work so hard all for our future. The more I looked at this man in front of me, the more repulsive he seemed. Suppressing the raging anger in my heart, I said to Xie Xun, Xie Xun, don't forget we've broken up. Get out of here. The ward was in an uproar, and the people outside started chattering again. I say, since Dr. Zhong is okay now, let it go. What could be more important than one's boyfriend's future? If I were her, I'd just swallow my pride. After all, if Dr. Xie makes it big in the future, she'll benefit too. Wang Xinru spun around and, pointing at those who were craning their necks to look, shouted angrily, "Stop gossiping here. That's not what really happened. The dean will hold an accident accountability meeting tomorrow. Then the truth will come to light. Let's see who'll be proven wrong." Xie Xun, who had always ignored Wang Xinru, finally looked at her squarely, frowning. "What did you say? What accident accountability?" Wang Xinru put her hands on her hips and, while speaking, stared intently at Lu Xinyu. "That's right. Everyone knows exactly how the accident in the laboratory occurred." Upon hearing this, Lu Xinyu visibly trembled. Her originally fair face instantly turned deathly pale, and she seemed on the verge of collapsing, presenting a heart-rending, fragile appearance. Xie Xun, seeing this, quickly held her tenderly, comforting her in a soft voice. "Xinyu, don't be afraid. It's all right. I believe you." Lu Xinyu leaned into Xie Xun's arms, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes, her voice quivering as she said, "Xie Xun, I know you won't believe their nonsense, right? That day in the laboratory, I clearly warned Wani." She deliberately paused, as if recalling something terrifying, and her body trembled uncontrollably again. "I told her to be careful, but she wouldn't listen and said I was meddling. Later, there was an explosion. I really did my best. I really wanted to save her." As soon as the outside had quieted down, upon hearing Lu Xinyu's words, people started pointing fingers at me again. So it was Dr. Zhong's operational error that caused the explosion. No wonder Dr. Xie didn't save her. After all, Goddess Lu is innocent. Xie Xun, seeing Lu Xinyu's helpless and fragile state, was filled with heartache. His anger flared up instantly. He spun around and, pointing at my nose, roared, "Zhong Wani, you made a mistake and still won't admit it. Do you think you're in the right? If you apologize to Xinyu now, I can still put in a good word for you at tomorrow's meeting, so that you won't." Wang Xinru and I exchanged a knowing smile, and I interrupted him. "If the two of you kneel down and apologize to me now, I can also show you some mercy at tomorrow's meeting." Lu Xinyu gave a half smile and said, "Wani, I'm doing all this for your own good. Why won't you appreciate it?" I no longer wished to deal with these two people. I reached out and pressed the nurse call button. The head nurse hurriedly pushed through the crowd and entered. "What's the matter?" I pointed at Xie Xun and Lu Xinyu. "I seem to recall that Dr. Xie and Dr. Lu aren't from this department, are they? Why are they so derelict in their duties?" The head nurse, who had never liked Xie Xun, said with a cold face, "Dr. Xie, stop disturbing Dr. Zhong. She's just had a whole night of surgery." Sensing my unyielding attitude, Xie Xun pointed at me, stammering for a while, and finally, angrily took Lu Xinyu's hand and slunk away. Xinru gazed at me, her eyes filled with complexity. After a long while she slowly uttered, "I think you've changed." I twitched the corner of my mouth. The smile that emerged was a mixture of bitterness and self-mockery. Having died once and seen through that scoundrel Xie Xun's true colors, this kind of awakening has come at too high a price. After dealing with the urgent matters at hand, Father rushed to my ward in a hurry. His eyes were bloodshot, his stubble growing wildly, and his face was haggard, filled with worry and exhaustion. "Wani, what on earth has happened to you? I've only been abroad for a short while. How could this?" His voice choked, and he couldn't continue. His trembling hand gently caressed the gauze on my face, his eyes brimming with heartache. Looking at my father, who seemed to have aged considerably overnight, my tears welled up and flowed uncontrollably. In my previous life, because I wrongly trusted Xie Xun, the hospital that the Zhong family had painstakingly managed for decades changed hands, and all our property was lost. Father couldn't bear this blow, fell ill, and passed away soon after. However, Xie Xun, stepping on the ruins of the Zhong family, soared to success in the medical field, and became a new luminary. But now, with Father still alive, I'm determined to protect him. I held Father's hand in return, weeping as I said, "Xinru must have told you everything. The laboratory explosion was definitely not my fault. That was the laboratory you gave me, Dad. How could I not cherish it? There's no way I could have caused this disaster." Father's voice was low and hoarse, suppressing his surging anger. "My dear daughter, don't worry. Whether she's really the daughter of Lu's medical group or not, Dad isn't afraid. I will never let you take the blame for something you didn't do." The next morning, Wang Xinru wheeled me to the meeting venue in a wheelchair. It was more like a criticism session than a meeting. Xie Xun and Lu Xinyu sat across from me, both looking indignant, as if I were the most heinous criminal. The conference hall was filled with the hospital's senior management. Father sat at the front, his face ashen. When he saw me enter, a glimmer of pity flashed in his eyes, and then he quickly regained his solemn expression. "Dr. Lu," Father fixed his piercing gaze on Lu Xinyu. "At that time, there were only you and Dr. Zhong in the laboratory. You insist that it was Dr. Zhong's operational error." Lu Xinyu shuddered, like a frightened fawn, her voice so soft as to be almost inaudible. "Dean, it's absolutely true. I once warned Dr. Zhong. Warned. Father slammed his hand on the table, his voice resounding like thunder, causing Lu Xinyu's eyes to well up with tears. Do you know the consequences of lying? Xie Xun frowned, and immediately stood up to defend his goddess. Dean, how can you be so sure that Dr. Lu is lying? Father gave him a cold stare, his voice icy. It's not your turn to speak here. Xie Xun was left speechless, and sat back down awkwardly. Although he was somewhat famous in the hospital, in front of Father, he was as timid as a mouse. Lu Xinyu's eyes were red-rimmed, and she said pitifully, Dean, how could I joke about the reputation of the Lu family? The Lu family? As soon as these words were uttered, the conference hall erupted into chaos. Those senior executives who had been dozing off just now suddenly perked up and started whispering to each other, discussing animatedly. Is she really the daughter of Lu's medical group? That's our hospital's largest partner. If we offend them, I think we'd better play this down. After all, no one died. Giving Dr. Zhong a disciplinary action will settle this matter. Father was so angry that his face turned deathly pale. Pointing at those senior executives who were speaking, he roared angrily. Are you saying that just because Dr. Lu is the daughter of a certain partner company, Dr. Zhong, who is innocent, should bear everything? I looked at this group of people, my heart filled with desolation. They were willing to push me mercilessly into the abyss for the sake of profit. The senior executives looked at each other, their eyes evasive. Father's face was as black as the bottom of a pot. With a sudden wave of his hand, Wang Xinro understood his intention, and quickly turned on the large screen in the conference room. The high-definition image instantly filled the entire screen, showing the surveillance footage before the laboratory accident. Lu Xinyu's face turned as white as a sheet of paper in an instant. Her lips trembled, and she kept shaking her head. Impossible. This can't be true. Didn't the hospital clearly prohibit the installation of surveillance in the laboratory? Father cast a cold glance at her and said in a deep voice, This laboratory was originally a private laboratory I gave to my daughter. Do I need to report to you about what I want to install? Xie Xun looked at me in shock, his face full of suspicion. What? I looked expressionless and coldly spat out a few words. Xinro mentioned it to you. The air seemed to freeze instantly, and the silence was so profound that a pin drop could be heard, until someone who was bold enough stammered. Dean, are you saying that Zhong Wani is your daughter? Wang Xinro ignored the astonishment of the crowd, and continued to operate the mouse, playing the surveillance footage. In the footage, I was wearing a white coat and a mask, conducting the experiment in an orderly manner. Everything was going perfectly normal. Suddenly, the experimental container in front of me spontaneously ignited without warning, with flames shooting up into the sky and thick smoke billowing. Seeing this, Xie Xun immediately pointed at the screen and shouted, Right here! Wani, you must have made an operational error. But don't worry, I can take the blame for you. Lu Xinyu visibly relaxed. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she put on a helpless and vulnerable look. I really didn't want to make Wani so embarrassed. It's all my fault. If only I had reminded her earlier. Father slammed his hand on the table, and Lu Xinyu shuddered all over. But those fickle senior executives, already intimidated by Lu Xinyu's acting skills and the name of the Lu family, all lowered their heads and advised, Dean, since this is the case, why not just let it go? One is the daughter of Lu's medical group, and the other is your daughter. If this matter gets out of hand, it will be bad for everyone. I admitted that at that moment, a glimmer of self-doubt flashed through my mind. But this doubt only lasted for a few seconds. After all, I had done this experiment hundreds of times. I could do it with my eyes closed, and my experimental project was not of the flammable type at all. Even if there was an error, it could never cause spontaneous combustion. Wang Xinro gave me a reassuring look, the corners of her mouth curving slightly. Then she said, Leaders, you only saw the spontaneous combustion of Wani's experimental container, but did you notice her specific operations at that time? Indeed, there were many instruments placed in front of my experimental container, blocking my movements. The surveillance footage could only show the operations of my upper body. However, Wang Xinro suddenly enlarged the glass cabinet behind my experimental bench several times. In the footage, Lu Xinyu sneaked up to my experimental bench. When I wasn't paying attention, she quickly poured an unknown reagent into my experimental container. The whole action was completed in one go, taking only a few seconds. I clenched my fists tightly, my anger boiling over. I shouted angrily, Lu Xinyu. Father pointed at Lu Xinyu and sternly asked, What else do you have to say? Lu Xinyu's face turned as white as a sheet of paper in an instant. She stumbled and fell to the ground, screaming hysterically, This must be a misunderstanding. No, it's Wang Xinro. You edited the video maliciously, didn't you? Just then, Father whispered a few words into his phone, and the door of the conference room was suddenly pushed open forcefully. Father's assistant walked in with a cold expression, followed by a majestic noblewoman. The noblewoman's eyes were like lightning. She swept a glance around the conference room, and finally fixed her eyes on Lu Xinyu. Miss Lu, the daughter of our Lu's medical group? Lu general manager. The senior executive stood up swish, and looked at father tremblingly. Dean, why don't we settle this privately? Our hospital really can't afford to lose the support of Lu's medical group. Yes, look, she's come here in person. Father sneered, lit a cigarette, and leisurely exhaled a smoke ring. General Manager Lu, take a good look. Is this really your daughter? At the mention of General Manager Lu Xinyu's face became even uglier. She lowered her head even more, her body trembling slightly, and dared not look directly at the noblewoman. The noblewoman gave her a contemptuous look and snorted. My daughter is currently studying abroad for a postgraduate degree. I want to see who on earth is so audacious as to impersonate my daughter. With that, the noblewoman grabbed Lu Xinyu's chin and forced her to raise her head. She's quite pretty, but her heart, how can it be so vicious? The senior executives, who had been worried about Lu Xinyu just now seemed to have changed into different people. They all cursed. Are you kidding me? How dare you deceive our hospital? Such a person should be sent to jail. She almost caused the dean's daughter to be slandered. This is simply outrageous. Xie Xun, who had originally wanted to speak, was frightened by Lu Xinyu's eyes and took several steps back. Finally, he managed to choke out a sobbing sentence. Lu Xinyu, how could you treat Wani like this? To be honest, I felt extremely disgusted. This man was hypocritical to the extreme. Lu Xinyu seemed to have heard the most ridiculous joke. She suddenly burst out laughing. Xie Xun, what right do you have to talk about me? Weren't you also indulging in my lies? Ever since you thought I was the daughter of Lu's medical group, haven't you been following me like a dog, wagging your tail and begging for mercy? Am I wrong? Ha 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 ha. You pretended to save me. Wasn't it also for your own sake? You hypocritical scoundrel. Although I hated Lu Xinyu, I had to admit that what she said was true. Xie Xun was a complete hypocrite. With all the truth revealed, several policemen walked in and said to Lu Xinyu, Miss Lu, you are suspected of intentional injury and fraud. Please come with us. Lu Xinyu's face was as white as a sheet of paper, and her body was on the verge of collapse. She looked at Xie Xun in horror. Xie Xun, save me. Save me. However, Xie Xun just coldly turned his head away, as if he had never known her. Lu Xinyu slumped to the ground in despair, like a withered flower. After Lu Xinyu was taken away by the police, the people in the conference room scattered in a rush, leaving only me, Wang Xinro, and Xie Xun, who was standing there like a log. Wani, I'm sorry, I was also deceived by Lu Xinyu. Xie Xun suddenly rushed in front of me, his face full of guilt, as if the cold-hearted bystander just now wasn't him. You believe me, I love you. Disgusting. Look at yourself. What a disgrace. Wang Xinro pushed him away and patted her hands in disgust, as if she had touched something dirty. I looked at Xie Xun coldly, a sarcastic arc forming at the corner of my mouth. Lu Xinyu needs a dog, but Zhong Wani don't. Lu Xinyu's case was quickly accepted and went to court. Eventually, she was sentenced to 1 year in prison and had her medical license revoked. Later, due to her good performance in prison, she was released early, and Xie Xun was expelled from the hospital by father. Other hospitals also shunned him. He had gone from a somewhat famous doctor to a Guijialao Su Renren Handa. A year later, my body had recovered almost completely. With father's permission, I returned to work at the hospital. Unexpectedly, on my first day back, I ran into Xie Xun again. He was wearing a peaked cap and a mask, sneaking into the hospital. Wang Xinro curled her lips in disgust. Does he think that with this disguise, no one will recognize him? I was slightly taken aback. Wang Xinro leaned over, with a mischievous smile on her face. You don't know, do you? He got that disease. TSK. Our hospital is an authority in this area. He can only come here for treatment. This is karma. I couldn't help but sneer. That disease really suited him. In the evening, when I was walking towards the parking lot, Xie Xun suddenly appeared in front of me. I instinctively let out a scream in fright. Seeing this, he quickly reached out to help me, but I subconsciously dodged. He scratched his head and smiled awkwardly. I heard from the nurse today that you're back, so, Wani, do you know how long I've been looking for you? We haven't broken up yet. How could you leave me? I took a deep breath and said expressionlessly, I told you we broke up a year ago. Stop pestering me. Xie Xun suddenly grabbed my wrist tightly, exactly on my old wound. It hurt so much that I gasped. Let go. But he tightened his grip even more, gritting his teeth and saying, Zhong Wani, if it weren't for your father, how could I have ended up like this? Don't you think you should be responsible for me? I sneered. You're really ridiculous. You have a filthy disease, and you're still talking to me about responsibility? Have some shame. His face instantly turned ashen with anger. In a fit of rage, he raised his hand to hit me. Just then, a pink handbag hit him hard in the face. Xie Xun, you son of a bitch. I turned around suddenly, and saw that it was Lu Xinyu. After spending half a year in prison, she had lost her former elegance. Now her face was full of anger. Lu Xinyu pointed at Xie Xun's nose and cursed. I looked for you as soon as I got out. But you fucking treated me like a free plaything, and threw me away after using me. And you dared to come to find this bitch Zhongwani behind my back. Xie Xun was stunned by the blow. It took him a few seconds to come to his senses. He pushed Lu Xinyu away. Get lost. Look at yourself in the mirror. What makes you think you can compare with Wani? Wani is the dean's daughter. Who the hell are you? Xie Xun, you're really hopeless. I sneered and deliberately raised my voice. Xie Xun, you can't delay this disease. Remember to come for a follow-up visit every day. Don't infect others. What? Lu Xinyu's eyes widened in disbelief, and she let out a shrill scream. Xie Xun, you actually have a filthy disease? Xie Xun, you've ruined me. With that, the two of them started fighting in the parking lot. I had no interest in this farce. I got into the car directly and slammed the door shut, locking it. But the two of them were like rabid dogs, getting more and more furious. I rolled my eyes and directly sent a message to the security captain in the work group. There are two rabid dogs fighting in the parking lot. Come and deal with it quickly. As soon as the message was sent, there was a loud bang. I looked up suddenly, and saw Lu Xinyu lying in a pool of blood. There was a car parked beside her, and the driver was holding his head and shouting, My God! Xie Xun turned around and ran, but was caught by the security uncle who rushed over. The colleagues from the hospital also came in droves. Lu Xinyu died on the spot. It was said that she was 5 weeks pregnant, and Xie Xun was clearly captured on the parking lot surveillance pushing Lu Xinyu out. Eventually, he was convicted of intentional homicide. As a doctor, I knew that his disease was incurable. For the rest of his life, he would rot away in prison. Serves him right. The end.